After laying out the basic moves of existentialism, the basic sort of structure of your task as a human, as a free human being, de Beauvoir considers several objections to the possibility that an existentialist ethics could be developed. And, given that she's responding to her own thinking that an existentialist ethics might not be possible, these are quite serious objections, and she responds to them. So she considers an objection and then gives a response, and not in like a really formalistic way. It's one of the things that's very useful in philosophy to look for is, like what is the author saying? What is the structure of the argument? And seeing that this is an objection and response sort of style, the last part of this chapter, can be very helpful in figuring out exactly what de Beauvoir is arguing and what the apparent weaknesses, what are the weaknesses that de Beauvoir sees in her own argument in existentialism as an ethics altogether. So the first objection is that, as Dostoevsky says, everything is permitted. If there's not any absolute, if God doesn't exist, then you can do anything. There would be no good and bad. And in response to this initial sort of claim that without God or some absolute, you can do anything, de Beauvoir argues not at all that for the existentialist, ethics become absolutely fundamental because you are responsible. You are the one who is creating yourself, and so you are entirely responsible for it. And so not everything is permitted. In fact, for the existentialist, ethics become even more important than if you think God is in control of everything. And we'll see some of that in the next chapter. The second objection is solipsism that comes out of the phenomenological tradition. So if consciousness is all that exists, if you are fundamentally consciousness and creating yourself in the world as you exist, then it looks like you don't have any responsibility for anybody outside of yourself, that you're the only one that exists or the only one that matters. And so how can there be an ethics given a kind of fundamental basis of reality in individual consciousness? And the response to this objection is curious. De Beauvoir says that individuals can form laws, that even though we're all individual beings creating our own consciousness, there's a way in which that individuality will articulate itself in a kind of group solidarity. And here's what she says, very curious passage on page 18. An ethics of ambiguity will be one which will refuse to deny a priori that separate existence can, at the same time, be bound to each other, that their individual freedoms can forge laws valid for all. So so reasonable that we're not going to reject from the beginning a priori before any, out of principle, we're not going to reject the possibility that our individual freedoms will work together. But this idea that our individual freedoms can forge laws valid for all is a curious statement. And in this place, she doesn't give us any reason to think that this is going to happen or how this is going to happen. So it's something to look for in the later text. So how can my choosing, my disclosing my own being also be sufficient for you in your disclosing your being? How do each of us acting independently end up forging laws that are valid for all? So this is going to be a question that we can ask, that we can look for in her later development. But perfectly reasonable. There's nothing that forbids this from happening within existentialism, but nothing that, on the face of it, suggests that there's any requirement that my decisions about what's right for me will in any way be connected to or valuable for your decisions for yourself. The third objection is similar to the first one in that Freedom would mean doing whatever you want instead of doing what's right. And this objection comes in response to the Marxist view, where freedom is problematic because it might go against acting towards establishing a communist society, acting towards the good of all. And so, if each of us is doing our own thing, the Marxist would say, then this is potentially problematic. This objection follows a section where de Beauvoir contrasts Marxism and existentialism. I'll have some commentary on that towards the end. But what's important for right now in thinking about the objection is de Beauvoir's response that freedom means willing yourself to do what is right, even though there's no predetermined sense of right and good in the way that it is with Marxism. You, as an existentialist, are choosing to do what is right. That is, you're not just going to choose to do whatever you want. And here is a long section, where she describes that and relates that back to this idea of what freedom is and how does it relate to disclosing being and choosing the right. Now, we have seen that the original scheme of man is ambiguous. He wants to be, and to the extent that he coincides with this wish, he fails. All the plans in which this will to be is actualized are condemned, and the ends circumscribed by these plans remain mirages. So you can't will to be. You have to, that's going to fail. You have to maintain your ambiguity. Human transcendence is vainly engulfed in those miscarried attempts. But man also wills himself to be a disclosure of being, and if he coincides with this wish, he wins. For the fact is that the world becomes present by his presence in it. But the disclosure implies a perpetual tension to keep being at a certain distance, to tear oneself from the world, and to assert oneself as a freedom. To wish for the disclosure of the world and to assert oneself as freedom are one and the same movement. Freedom is the source from which all significations and all values spring. It is the original condition of all justification of existence. The man who seeks to justify his life must want freedom itself absolutely and above everything else, at the same time that it requires the realization of concrete ends of particular projects. It requires itself universally. So I'm choosing various things that I think are right and good, but I'm ultimately choosing to choose. That's the basis of freedom, and that's the basis of all of life, according to the existentialist. So I'm choosing myself, I'm disclosing the world as I'm choosing, so I'm engaging myself and my consciousness in the world that I am in and figuring out what it is and figuring out what I am and other people. All of that sort of process is an ongoing process that is my life and my life project. And this is the one absolute that is fundamental to the existentialist. The fourth objection is interesting because it raises what seems like a contradiction within existentialism itself. If everyone is already free by virtue of existing, then how can you will yourself to be free? In other words, how can you will to be what you already are? So what the existentialist says is we are essentially consciousness and we are essentially nothing except what we choose to be. So that freedom is basic to being human, that humanity is just consciousness. That's the phenomenology and the Cartesian ego stuff. The heritage of that's fundamental to existentialism. So if you are already, everybody is this consciousness, is this conscious choosing, then how can it be something that you have to do? How can there be an ethics of that if that's already what you are? And here's the very interesting response from de Beauvoir. The critical movement is from natural to moral. You can deny the capacity to will and be a pure contingency, to be absurd, a vain living palpitation. So these are, are epithets that we hurl at people who fail to actually choose who they are. So the movement here again is from natural to moral, that you are a freely choosing being, but you can deny that. You can pretend that you are just a lump of clay, or fated to be whatever it is that you are. And so the key movement is to embrace that ambiguity and embrace the necessity for choosing what you will be as you go through your life. And one of the interesting aspects of this choosing what you will be over your life is the temporal aspect, that it's a life project, that it unfolds itself. You disclose yourself over the course of time. It's not something that you decide, okay, so I'm going to be a philosopher, boom, I'm done, and then you're a philosopher. That would be to fail, and you would be instead of become. So, so this is this constant choosing of who you're going to be over the course of your life. And this is de Beauvoir's description of this life project. Setting up the movement of my transcendence requires that I never let it uselessly fall back upon itself, that I prolong it indefinitely. Thus, I cannot genuinely desire an end today, that is to say, a goal. I can't desire a goal today without desiring it through my whole existence. So, it's not just that I'm going to have like a piece of cake today and then, I'm not going to have cake ever again or something like that, or I'm going to desire to be a philosopher today and then, give it up tomorrow. But there needs to be an extension of my choices so that tomorrow I don't regret having the cake today. Maybe I don't have another piece of cake. I don't know what would possess me not to have another piece of cake, but you can change. I could give up philosophy tomorrow. That would be okay. That wouldn't be inauthentic. But I shouldn't ever regret that I chose to be a philosopher now. So every day, every choice is something that you need to embrace forever, for your whole life. Insofar as it is the future of this present moment, and insofar as it is the surpassed past of days to come. To will is to engage myself to persevere in my will. So I'm willing to will, and I'm willing to have willed, and I'm willing to continue to will. And so I need to do things today that preserve that preserve my integrity as a being that has chosen the things that I have chosen. The fifth objection considers limits, things that are not under my control. How can I choose if there are things that I just can't do? So I want to be a basketball player, but I'm not tall enough. They won't accept me to be a basketball player. So how am I really free given that I can't be a basketball player? And this seems a little bit petty, but there are other kinds of conditions that do seem to severely restrict freedom. I'm born in poverty. I'm born in a repressed class in a country, and so do not have the freedom to express myself or to be the self that I am or that I want to be. This seems to be a serious problem. There seem to be these structural limits to choosing the being that I want to be. And in response to this, de Beauvoir says that the point is to will, not to succeed. That I might, if I really, really, really authentically want to be a basketball player, I need to will that. I need to be true to that choice and to do what I can. And, and who knows, maybe I'd be the first 5-foot-tall female basketball player. That's not really an authentic choice for me. And so what about those other sorts of choices? I'm born in poverty, or I'm born in a repressed class and in a society. The point is that I might not succeed in escaping poverty. I might not succeed in escaping oppression in my world, but I have to keep trying. That's what the existentialist is called to do, is to try to will one's projects authentically, even if you don't succeed. The limitations will prevent the success, but they don't prevent the willing. And ultimately, the ultimate choice is suicide. If you are in an entirely untenable situation, if the limitations are on your freedom are so strong that there is no way at all for you to be the being that you are, then you can always kill yourself. And that is a potentially authentic choice. It's one of the aspects of existentialism that seems so very dark, is the way in which suicide does seem to be a choice that suicide is a choice that you can authentically make. It's endorsed by existentialism. But it shouldn't be a choice that you make. Again, that's one of the things that we can look at going forward is, so what are the reasons why you wouldn't commit suicide according to the existentialists? What are the reasons to prevent you from committing suicide? Because there are reasons within existentialism, so we should look for those as well. And then finally, the question is how is bad willing possible? Again, if we are not anything essentially, if there's no absolute goods or truths or any of that sort of stuff, then how could you ever do bad? And there seems to be like there's no good. If there's no bad, there's no authenticity. If there's not inauthenticity. And in that contrast, we see what the response is to the objection, that one, bad willing is a failure to will authentically, a failure to embrace your ambiguity, embrace your lack of being, your choices, and to fail to assert your freedom in both yourself and others. That it's also not enough that you just try to be the best existentialist you can be. You need to also recognize that other conscious beings are also free choosers, and you need to support their choices as well. This is going to be an important aspect of the ethics of ambiguity, is thinking about others as well as yourself. And another thing to look for in going forward is where the motivation comes for you to care about anybody but yourself. How does my freedom imply being interested in other people's freedoms? So these are sorts of things that will be addressed further in the next chapter. De Beauvoir is going to look at ways in which we can fail, different forms of bad willing. So as you read that chapter, think about the different ways that you fail, and think about whether any of them applies to you. Are you a bad willer? Are you inauthentic in one of these ways? And if so, is that not a bad thing? What might be a reason to adopt one of the ways of being that de Beauvoir and the existentialists reject? Is there perhaps an essence and not just existence? Is there being and not just a lack